It's my pleasure to welcome today Dr. Regina Heller as a guest for this Monnet Lectures cycle. And thank you so much in advance for accepting the invitation. I'll just do a brief introduction of Regina and then give her immediately the floor. So Regina Heller is a senior researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at University of Hamburg in Germany. She studied political science and East Slavic studies at the University of Mainz, at the Middlebury College in the USA, and at the University of Hamburg. She has worked as project manager at the Conflict Prevention Network, at the Foundation for Politics and Science in Ebenhausen and Berlin, as coordinator of the research project International Risk Policy at the Center for Transatlantic Foreign and Security Policy at the Free University of Berlin, and as project manager of the German-American-Russian dialogue at the Aspen Institute in Berlin. In 2006, Regina Heller received her PhD from the Hamburg University on the topic of human rights and norm socialization in Russia. Since 2008, she is member of the Scientific Advisory Council of the Cologne Forum for International Relations and Security Policy. She has also taught at the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg, also University of German Armed Forces. Her research interests focus on EU as a norm exporter, EU-Russia relations, EU neighborhood policy, Russian domestic and foreign policy, and she has a wide number of publications in these topics. And with no further ado, I'll just give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Raquel, very much for the invitation to the Monnet Lecture. It's a pleasure for me to be here in Coimbra, and I welcome you to my lecture, which is not directly on European issues or EU issues, but is of course connected to EU foreign policy and the question of how should we approach Russia in current times, this is a suggestion of how to understand probably Russian foreign policy better and how to give some input to this always recurring question, what does Russia want and how do we have to understand Russian foreign policy? This is on Russia's Ukraine policy and Russia's rationales or the reasons behind this political stance. Defending social status and why Russia's Ukraine policy is about more than regional leadership. Those of you who follow the academic literature or also the journals, the media, probably see a lot of comments and articles and analysis on the rationales of Russian Ukraine policy. And the general claim or the dominant claim is actually that it is about geopolitics. That is the main driver. It's about security, it's about material power considerations, it's about enhancing Russia's regional hegemony in the post-Soviet space, it's about defending Russia's sphere of influence. So this is a classical neorealist claim for those of you who are into international relations theory. Neorealist claim, material power considerations. Some say it's a status quo policy, it's defending the traditional sphere of influence. Some say it's even a revisionist policy. The status quo variant is more according to Waltz, and the revisionist claim is more according to Mersheimer, saying that revisionism is explained on geopolitics, but also adding on to domestic developments in Russia that give an impetus to a revisionist policy in Ukraine in particular. So what about this neorealist geopolitical claim? So should we follow that? Should we believe it? In fact, there is a lot of evidence of geopolitics and neorealist explanation, looking into the structure and the explaining variables which we know from neorealism. Of course, there's a geographical evidence. Russia is the by far biggest country in the region. It has a historical legacy. It used to be the historical hegemon over many hundreds of years in the post-Soviet region, first as a Tsarist empire and later as the Soviet Union. So the geographical evidence is there to project power in the region. There's economic evidence, of course. We're not so much interested in the concrete figures in that slide, but just to visualize that Russia is by far the biggest economy of the post-Soviet space. It is still the most important trading partner for the post-Soviet space, for the post-Soviet countries, and it is the most important energy provider in that region. So economically, the neorealist and geopolitical explanation fits again. Militarily, military potential, again, yeah, Russia projects power militarily in the region. It has still a lot of military bases in nearly all of the post-Soviet countries. There are left 7, I think, 7 big bases. Plus the Black Sea Fleet on the Crimean Peninsula. So you see from that map that also militarily Russia is active in the post-Soviet region as well. And there are, of course, also cultural trajectories. Russia has a lot of minorities, there are a lot of ethnic Russians living in the post-Soviet countries. For instance, in Kazakhstan, there's a big Russian ethnic minority, but also in Estonia, in Ukraine, of course, in eastern Ukraine. And up to 17% of ethnic Russians are living outside Russia in the post-Soviet space, so nearly a fifth. Yeah? And of course, Russian is the lingua franca in the post-Soviet space, so there's some cultural dominance as well. Okay, so there is reason to believe that Russia once project power in all these spheres in its neighborhood. And here again, John Mersheimer, who has written an article after the crisis in Ukraine and saying, yeah, what we see in Ukraine, what the Russian foreign policy, the aggressive stance, annexation of Crimea, informal intervention into eastern Ukraine, is all about projecting this power and remaining dominant in the post-Soviet space. And it is actually provoked by ever-increasing competition from the West. So Russia's policy is the result of an inevitable geopolitical competition between Russia and Western integration projects that interfere in that sphere of influence and that apparently leads to a defensive reaction. Pure geopolitics. But when we look a little bit closer, we see that this geopolitical explanation comes with a number of paradoxes, which are not covered by the neorealist explanation. The first one is that when we look more specifically or more closely, then we see that Russia actually loses power and influence in the wider region. It doesn't increase its power and influence. Influence is diminished or is being reduced. And the second paradox which I found is that by annexing Crimea, Russia actually, or intervening into Ukraine domestic affairs, it actually violates those rules that are associated with the normative order Russia actually promotes. So non-intervention into domestic affairs, sovereignty as the prime principle of the international world. So the classical Westphalian state-centered world order is deliberately violated by Russian Ukraine policy. Okay. And by that, so if the realist argument would say the initial impetus is security and securing the space around Russia as a buffer zone or whatever, we see that actually Russia creates instability in its region. In Ukraine, we will have an unstable state for many, many years to come. And we have an unstable neighborhood. So actually this all runs counter to what neo-realist and geopolitical logic would us assume to think or predict. Now, how could we make sense of these paradoxes, or of these gaps, which are not filled by the neo-realist explanation? So my approach is a little bit different. I would like to suggest the hypothesis that Russia's Ukraine policy is an expression of the country's elites' concern over its social status in world politics. Social or global social status, meaning a positively distinctive identity in the international social order. So it's about ideational factors, not so much about material factors, about identity, about social relationship, about the social construction of status. And I think that emotions as a factor play in here very prominently, or very important to consider. My approach is to say that what we see now is the result of a Russian feeling of anger over perceived or real disrespect or status deprivation that comes from experiences from the past, especially in the relations with the West, and materializes now in its Ukrainian policy. Anger as an emotion inspires foreign policy behavior, so it sets the markers for strategic decision-making or further interest production, and it changes foreign policy behavior. It can change foreign policy behavior. And if such an emotion like anger emotionally resonates in an identity or in a society, then it has the potential to mobilize and enable what I call a resentment policy. So what we see in Ukraine, I would term it a resentment policy. Resentment policy is based on negative experience, emotional experience, and especially here in the relations with the West. So it's a social-emotional approach that doesn't fit in any of the conventional readings of international relations. The emotional variable was neglected for a long time in the literature, in the IR literature, but it now has some dynamic. A lot of researchers I meet on conferences, they embark on this emotional explanation, or at least they consider emotion as an important variable or an important factor that changes the rationales of foreign policy making. Okay? Probably first a little bit on what anger actually is, or how we should understand the logics of anger then in policy making, foreign policy making. So this is very much drawn from psychology, from individual psychology. Of course, one could ask, how do you then transfer individual psychology to a state? Yeah, does a state have emotions or not? So we can discuss that later, but there are ways to conceptualize But that first you have to understand what actually the emotion anger is and what it does. And in the psychological literature and also in the sociological literature, it is said that anger is defined as a negative emotional reaction to negative external stimuli. So if you say, also if you, call me someone, yeah, I'm getting angry and I want to slap you in the face or be also rude to you, whatsoever. And with that, in a psychological process, we see three different lines of psychological processes. There is a cognitive dimension, a perceptual dimension. That means that cognitive evaluation change. Yeah, so if you are rude to me, then I say, okay, you're not my friend anymore. This is the cognitive evaluation. Yeah, from friend to foe. Okay, cognitive changes. Physiological changes, this is more related to the individual psychology. So if I'm angry, if I'm getting angry, I'm getting red, I'm sweating, my voice is getting louder, things like that. So this is the pure physiological dimension, which is difficult to trace in international relations or bigger groups. It's more related to individuals, but just to add it here. And then anger comes with typical action tendencies, as I said, pushback, or also retreat can also be a typical reaction tendency to anger. So this is what is established in the psychological literature. There are a couple of reactions on a cognitive, physiological, and behavioral level which we can trace under anger. What is for me now most important if I transfer it to international relations or foreign policy behavior, I see mainly two things. That the emotion anger leads to a change in the assessment of costs and gains. So being rude to you or is more a gain, like for my self-worth than it was before. Yeah. So the whole idea of what behavior is costly and what behavior is gives me some gains changes. This is also established in the literature. Emotions want to be communicated. If somebody, especially anger, if I'm angry, this emotion usually wants to be communicated. People want to say, I'm angry. I'm angry at you. I dislike this. I don't accept whatever. So in different varieties. So when I look into foreign policy behavior or emotions, anger in foreign policy, I would look on how do the costs and gains of a specific behavior change, or what, differently said, what can I say about cost and benefit assessments in a specific policy? Yeah? And the second one is, can I trace the emotion anger in discourse? Can I trace specific anger markers in the language, and what do they tell me? Why do I think that social status is an issue for the Russian political elite? I think it is important because Russia, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, has definitely lost status from a superpower to maybe a regional power or even less. In the 1990s, it might have been even less, although nobody competed or nobody challenged that regional status at least. When we go through the Russian foreign policy structure or its positioning in the world, then we see three central status markers. The one is centrality. Centrality applies to or means the right and ability to disperse power via the United Nations. So Russia has a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. This is like an elevated position, so there's some material status, and there's also, of course, it gives the right to somebody to be a very VIP, very important person in international relations. The second is the claim for equality. Equality is very important for Russia, specifically in European security. If you think about NATO issues or European missile defense dispute, then it's always about Russia being included in European security decision making on an equal footing. Yeah? Things like the NATO-Russia Council in NATO is like a red carpet for Russia, because it always feels treated not on an equal footing, because it's always the NATO countries, and Russia can say yes, okay, yeah, yes, no, yes, but it doesn't matter. And the same is with the European missile defense issue. Russia has always said, we have some concerns about it, we dislike it, but the Americans, and then later NATO, because UMDS was included into NATO, said, yeah, this doesn't concern you, and we will do it anyway. The West has responded a little bit to Russian security concerns, but never apparently to a level that Russia was satisfied with the solution. So they actually wanted to see it abolished at all, and this was, of course, non-negotiable to the Americans or the West as a whole. And of course, then regional primacy as the post-Soviet space as a traditional sphere of influence, as I have said. And the Russian elites have not once underlined that this is a region of importance, of high importance for Russia, that Russia has an exclusive right in that region, and whatever happens, or whenever this exclusive right is challenged, then things are being worse. This social status concern is very well expressed in a statement by Dmitry Rogozin. Dmitry Rogozin, former NATO representative, Russian representative to NATO, who said after the Russian-Georgian War 2008, which was first rupture in Russian foreign policy, because it was the first time that Russia intervened militarily against the will of a neighbor in a neighbor country. So this was a real rift in Russian foreign policy. He said Brussels, meaning the West, NATO and the EU, has now started to look at Russia differently, namely with respect, and I consider this to be Russia's key diplomatic achievement. Okay, so these are the kinds of wordings and formulations which I then try to look for, which have a different, or which transport a different notion than only the geopolitical or security notion. So the respect has a social emotional dimension. Yeah? Okay, now I would like to go a little bit into these two dimensions. One is the cost and gain analysis of Russia's Ukraine policy, and the other one later is the discourse and the rhetoric. Now the gains. What did Russia actually gain with its Ukraine policy, annexing Crimea, intervening in eastern Ukraine? So what did Russia gain territorially? Crimea, for sure. Control, indirect, maybe even direct control over Luhansk and Donetsk region. As you probably know, many of the leaders of the independence movement in eastern Ukraine are Russians. They are immigrated Russians. They come from Russia and have now found their task of leading the independence movement there. So, and Russia is supporting them militarily, politically still. So, territorially, Russia controls Crimea and the eastern Ukraine region. The costs. Maybe on the gains with controlling Crimea and interfering in Ukrainian domestic affairs, one could of course argue that at least Russia has achieved that any kind of NATO enlargement in the foreseeable future is excluded. NATO enlargement on Ukraine and maybe also on Georgia, as has been discussed since 2005, 2007, is being excluded. So one could say this is like the neo-realist argumentation, geopolitical argumentation. Of course, Russia has achieved this. So there is a game. The costs. Now some financial costs, material costs, financial costs. One could argue is that, of course, Russia did not have a lot of costs in directly annexing Crimea or intervening in eastern Ukraine in a direct sense. Actually, the Russians always argue that Crimea there was not one shot, not one person dead, and it was really on a low cost. It didn't really cost a lot. But the longer term costs, when we look at what Russia is investing in these regions, in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine particularly, then you see a lot of financial burdens. For instance, subsidies to Crimea amount to estimated $4 to $6 billion per year. This is the bridge over the Strait of Kerch, which is the closest link from southern Russia to Crimea. That is said to cost $5 billion, the whole bridge. Social welfare, and of course, Crimea suffers from losses from the Western sanctions. A lot of companies had to close down their activities. Tourists don't come anymore to Crimea. I think 70% or 60 or 70% of tourism came from Ukraine. So the most of the tourists came from Ukraine to Crimea, not from Russia. Russia has to compensate for these direct economic losses on Crimea, and of course social welfare, infrastructure, electricity, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of financial burden to carry. Subsidies to eastern Ukraine. Russia started in 2016 to bankroll pensions to pensioners in eastern Ukraine, pay out social benefits and salaries to local employees. It initially didn't want to take over responsibility for that, but finally in 2016 Russia started. And here estimates are about $1 billion per year as well. This all against the backdrop of a severe economic crisis Russia is going through since 2014. This graph shows a little bit how the economic crisis developed. It reached its peak apparently in 2015, 2016, and then 2017 the economy recovered a little bit, but still the situation is still tensed, and Russia has to cut spending in all areas of its budget. The only area where it doesn't cut but increase its spending is defense. Here another graph where we see that until 2015 defense spending has increased and makes up more than 20% of the whole Russian budget. So what experts say, or what we can see in the literature, is the assessment that Russia is militarizing its economy. Russia has embarked on a path where it doesn't follow a comprehensive modernization of its economy anymore, which is urgently needed actually to become resilient in the globalized economy, but is embarking more and more on military spending, military development, and so on. So all is, or a lot of resources are directed towards the military and the defense area. And the overall modernization goal that has been formulated already in the early 2000s is actually abolished. On costs, what did Western sanctions contribute to the costs, or maybe to the economic crisis? And here we see that apparently the Western sanctions economically didn't make a real impact. So estimates say that only the sanctions affected the Russian economy only to 1%, negatively. So there is not a lot of economic impact of the sanctions, which is probably good, but because if the effect would have been bigger, then the economy would have been probably even worse, and the militarization effect or the authorization effect would have been even stronger. So experts also say, yeah, luckily the sanctions didn't have that big of an effect. Okay, defense spending. Okay, so this is the direct costs of Russian economy, material costs. So now I want to broaden the picture a little bit on the region. What impact actually does Russia's policy have on the wider region, or on Russia's legitimacy as a regional leader? As you know, Russia, together with Kazakhstan and Belarus, initiated the customs union and later on integrated into the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and now also Armenia since 2014-15, I'm not sure. So those four are members of the Eurasian Economic Union. So these countries are actually reliable partners, economic partners, and also political partners of Russia, one could say. What we see here economically is that, so this has not a direct, I don't claim that there's a direct connection between Ukraine policy and the drop of these GDPs, but what we see here is that while between 2006 and 2015 there was like a considerable growth, economic growth in all these countries. In the year 2014 to 2015, we have a considerable drop in Belarus. The economic development in Kazakhstan is less than moderate. And in Russia, this is the visualization of the economic crisis. And if you add this all together, you see that the GDP in all EU countries taken together has been decreasing significantly. Many of these countries are not amused about that. They had hoped that that with the integration in the EU, also the economic situation would become better. But apparently, this was here not the case. As you see from this graph. This graph visualizes the amount of trade between Russia and the various countries. You see that Belarus is highly dependent economically on Russia, and Kazakhstan not so dependent, so there are strong relations, economic relations, but it's not that dependent. So the share is not that high. But Belarus, you see, is a very dependent, economically very dependent country. Now, what has happened after Russian annexation in Crimea and Ukrainian crisis? For instance, example Kazakhstan, we see that the relations have not necessarily been developing to the better. There were some incidences where you can say that some kind of disintegration effects have taken place. For instance, Russia imposed the counter-sanctions against the EU without the consent of the EU partners, so without the consent of the partners of the Eurasian Economic Union. Kazakhstan was not very amused about that, and as a reaction to that imposed limits to imports from Russia and also imposed restrictions on labor migration. That is the economic dimension. The political dimension adds up to this. In 2014, Putin gave a speech in front of a Russian youth organization, and there he said Kazakhstan never had a state, and Kazakhstan never had any statehood, which was perceived in Kazakhstan as a threatening of the sovereignty of Kazakhstan, and the Kazakhs have something to worry because more than 20% of ethnic Russians are living in Kazakhstan, focused or specifically focused on in the north of Kazakhstan. So there is also a definable region of ethnic Russians living there. And of course they were afraid of independence movements or spillover effects from Ukraine. After Putin claiming things like that. So the reaction to that was an amendment to the penal code that says that calls for secession and the threatening of the territorial integrity of Kazakhstan is now under punishment. Yeah, so that have toughened the legal situation on secessionism. And then also in 2014, Nazarbayev himself, the Kazakh president, publicly recalled Kazakhstan's right to withdraw from the Eurasian Economic Union. So as a threat, saying, so if you are overdoing things, so we can also undertake steps. And we are not so dependent on you. Maybe you're more dependent on us than we are on you, probably. So this is some kind of disintegration, and there's a conflictive dynamic and some kind of a disintegration effect within the Eurasian Economic Union. Secondly, Belarus. As I said, Belarus is highly dependent economically on Russia. Politically, we have seen a lot of disputes which have an economic foundation as well. So the relations between Belarus and Russia have not been always positive or without conflict, although as we read these days, Russia and Belarus increase apparently their maneuvers, joint military maneuvers at the western outskirts of the post-Soviet space in Belarus, but especially when it comes to economics, the relations have been problematic for many years. And what we see here after the Ukrainian crisis is that Belarus uses Russia's economic weakness more strategically than before to pressing for better conditions in the trade relations with Russia. And it does so also by embarking on political issues. Lukashenko claimed solidarity with Ukraine. So Lukashenko didn't support the UN resolution that called Russia condemned Russia's intervention or the annexation of Crimea. But at the same time, it claims from time to time solidarity with Ukraine, with the new Ukrainian leadership, and some have called it also a fraternization policy. So they fraternize, find good words for the Ukrainian government, and so there is not a clear pro-Russian positioning. So they try to press better economic relations by embarking on political issues. And here we also see like a little bit of a increase of the conflictive dynamic of the relationship. To make things worse, and this has also to do with the economic weakness that Russia is going through at the moment, and maybe also for a longer time, is that China is on the march, especially in Central Asia. You might have heard of the One Belt, One Road initiative, or the so-called Silk Initiative, a Silk Road initiative that China initiated. That is perceived in Central Asia as a very attractive alternative to cooperation with Russia and to cooperation within the Eurasian Economic Union. They say that in industrial-wise, trade-wise, also in the financial sector, China makes much more attractive proposals, this initiative also directly challenges the rules of engagement within the Eurasian Economic Union, as it promotes bilateral relations and not relations through the Eurasian Economic Union. So it spoils the Eurasian Economic Union community and embarks on bilateral relations with the Central Asian countries. And this is received very positively. Yeah. So what I want to say is that Russia is kind of maybe losing, or at least it is not able to uphold the level of legitimacy it has reached so far in that region. So, and if we talk about geopolitics and regional leadership as a goal, we see that there are in fact counterproductive effects. Now to the discourse dimension. What can we say about the social status concerns, anger-induced social status concerns in Russia's Ukraine policy? What is important to see is that, of course, the Russians themselves, the Russian policymakers themselves argue that the West is threatening our security, it's aggressive, Russia's support for the revolution in Ukraine is an aggressive move. It's also revisionism or whatever. So it wants to. It's all in this new realist logic. But beyond that, or underneath that, we see also a different form of argumentation, which I call a moral discourse. And a moral discourse usually embarks on emotions, or a moral discourse highly activates or reactivates emotional experiences. And in this case, we see one line of moralization that has a lot to do with Western interventionist practices of the past. So Western interventionism, Kosovo, Iraq, and the Ukraine case is another one then for Russia, where we see argumentative lines like the West has supported criminal forces, so this is a delegitimization of Western policy. The West supports an unconstitutional turnover in Ukraine, which is delegitimizing Western interventionism. And the West is instrumentalizing civil society, which is delegitimizing Western interventionist practices. So it's all about delegitimizing the Western interventionist practices, and it ties up. So in the rhetoric, we also find trajectories that go from Kosovo over Iraq and all these cases which had been a point of anger for Russia in the past. And for instance, Putin said in response to protests regarding the Crimea annexation, it's a good thing that the West finally called to their minds that there is something like international law. Thank you very much, better late than never. So this is again a very ironic, or even more to say a sarcastic comment on the Western protests. So this is all what I say, these are elements which have nothing actually to do, or not directly something to do with a geopolitical or security argument. Yeah, it's a moral argument. It's a moralization, and this moralization reactivates and reactivates the emotion of anger. Tries to mobilize this feeling. Yeah. And the second dimension of the moral discourse or the moral argumentation I see in the not related to the international norms or the practice of the normative practice of the West, but in the bilateral relation between Russia and the West, in the relational structure. So there has been always, and we can trace this again back to many cases from Kosovo, NATO enlargement, European missile defense, Georgia, and so on and so on, this image of the West dictating Russia something and not allowing Russia to participate on equal footing is a big issue. And here it is reactivated again. As Putin said in the speech with regard to the Crimea annexation, we are constantly suggesting cooperation on all key questions. We try to increase the level of mutual trust. We want that our relationship is an equal, open and honest one. But we never saw reciprocal moves. On the contrary, they cheated us over and over again, took decisions behind our back. They presented us with fait accompli. This happened with NATO enlargement towards the east and with the rapprochement of military infrastructure towards our borders. They kept telling us the same thing. Well, this does not concern you. This does not concern you. This does not concern you. That's said easily. Yeah? And this is something we find in all the years since, openly since 2007, the famous Munich speech that Putin gave at the security conference in Munich. But we find this image of Western dictatorship even before. So the Kosovo issue that already emerges, the West dictates Russia its will. Again, this is also not necessarily connected to a security geopolitical logic. This has a moral foundation, this has an emotional foundation, this has a social dimension, and is all for me an incident of the emotion that resonating in these speeches and in these expressions and in the discourse. And the third element of the moralization discourse is incidences in the speeches of Russian Schadenfreude. So the German word Schadenfreude, there's no translation to it in any language, I guess, at least not in English. It's kind of the feeling of satisfaction over another person's setbacks. Yeah, this is Schadenfreude. So you fail, I'm happy. That's Schadenfreude. And this is what we also find in the Russian discourse. And this, again, has nothing to do with security considerations. Yeah? It's a purely emotional element in the discourse. So, and this relates both to Ukrainian setbacks and Western setbacks. So here are two examples. The first one relates to the West. Putin said, the West would have been well advised to consider the consequences of its influencing the situation in Ukraine before. Yeah? So we told you, you didn't listen. Okay? And on Ukraine, I feel honestly sorry, this is Medvedev, that the representatives of the Ukrainian elite were not able to neither present nor implement another strategic program for the development of the country. As the head of a government, I can see this every day, the figures confirming. Unfortunately, the hardest part still lies in front of our neighbors. So again, it's your fault. So we told you, yeah. Okay, so again, this has nothing to do with security considerations. We find these moralization elements all around the discourse. To conclude, is that with this assessment or analysis, I want to show that Russia's Ukraine policy is not primarily or necessarily about geopolitics and security considerations, but about forcing the West to accept a new status power structure, a more symmetrical status power structure where Russia is an equal global power, and by doing that it accepts high costs and a risky policy, legitimacy costs in the region, and it tries rhetorically to produce a narrative in which Russia's social status as a major global power is guaranteed. I don't want to say that other rationale, security considerations, domestic power interests do not play a role. So of course they play a role, and one probably has to research further how these relate to each other. Of course, embarking on emotions strengthens the domestic elite currently and strengthens their power situation and consolidates power of the current elite. But so we have to see how this interacts. But by looking into the emotional dimension, the social status concern dimension, we can fill blind spots that are left behind from the geopolitics approach. And this is an argument that the rationalist epistemology is not satisfactory enough, that we have to find more fine-tuned ways of thinking about international relations and about Russian foreign conduct in particular, in our case. And of course, we also see that what the Russians want us to believe, that it's all about geopolitics and it's all about security, is not necessarily true, and that there is a huge and increasing gap between Russia's global power ambitions and its regional, or its power performance and its potential. So it performs poorly in the region and maybe even worse in the future, but the ambitions raise. Yeah, the ambitions are very high. So there's a huge gap between what it actually claims to be and what it literally can achieve. And with that, I leave it to you to ask me questions and challenge my assumptions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's open the floor for debate, for questions. Maybe you want to have a seat.
Yeah.
Maybe I can also join you here. And let's have a debate. So let's open the floor. Who wants to start? I'm sure there are some questions around for sure.
So, you have mentioned the fact that you have a big cost of those kind of operations, and the fact that Russia is in crisis and military costs are capped and become increased as a part of the government spending. So do you think that those kind of operations are only on the short term, will be, how to say, like, will Russia be able to continue those kind of operations, or is just thinking in the short term?
Immediately to go ahead while they
warm up.
while they warm up.
As we see now from the news, apparently Russia prepares, or it tries to make the impression that it becomes more able to embark on more in-depth military activities. So like an intelligence report from these days suggests that Russia, as I said, increases its maneuvers at the western geographical area with Belarus, doubles, I think, the maneuvers. And the intelligence reports say that Russia is more capable, wants to show that it is more capable of actually also pursuing military operations, in-depth military operations. So I guess, yes, and that's what we see in Syria as well. The Syrian intervention has been effective, so it has been very targeted. New military material and technology has been probed there. So the militarization and a concentration on military buildup has also some impact. And I think the idea is to be capable of, or at least to show that Russia is capable of embarking on major military operations. Another thing would be, if you ask, now we saw intervention in Ukraine, could that happen, for instance, in the Baltics? Because as we see in the Baltics, there in Estonia, if I'm correct. There is also, in Estonia, there's also nearly 25% of ethnic Russians. They're also living in two territories, more or less defined territories, and there's always the discussion or the fear that Russia could try to mobilize this ethnic minority to trouble Estonia and to trouble the European Union, to spoil the EU and to force or reinforce existing disintegration tendencies by troubling Estonia. And here I would say that the situation is a little bit different, or maybe militarily Russia would be capable of doing or intervene. I guess that wouldn't be the problem. And by the way, Putin said he could have been marched to Kiev if he wanted to, but he didn't, so I guess that's right. But with Estonia, the situation is a little bit different because the ethnic minority, the Russian ethnic minority in Estonia is better integrated in the society. They are economically better off than other Russian minorities in other post-Soviet space, and the vulnerability of that part of the society is not that high as probably in other regions. In Kazakhstan, I'm not so sure how the ethnic Russians are off, but at least in Estonia, there's quite a solid situation, and there are a couple of things going on. Specifically, Russia tries to influence via civil society organizations, youth organizations, specific media outlets, discussions on the internet, tries to influence the ethnic Russians in Estonia, but so far there has not been like a critical mass or something that would have like turned into protest or political movement or anything. So I think the situation in Estonia is quite stable.
It's part of NATO.
Hey? Sorry?
It's part of NATO, no?
Yes, yeah. The Baltics are part of NATO. Yeah.
That's also part of the reasoning, no?
Yeah, of course, that's also part of the reasoning. But you could, of course, I mean, you would not then probably interfere militarily, but try to spoil different in different ways.
In the 19th, Brzezinski wrote a book close to grain cheese ball. And paraphrasing what he's saying, if Ukraine chooses the side of Russia, Russia will continue to be a great power. If Ukraine decides to break away from Russia, Russia will be reducing to the second right power. Don't you think that the relation between the EU and Russia, both sides are becoming more geopolitical? I mean, if in the side of the EU thinks that Russia has a thought, a geopolitical thought, and the other side they will think the same thing. Don't you think that this is tricky?
Yeah, what is interesting is that the former NATO enlargement rounds, Russia didn't really like it, but there were possibilities to bargain. Yeah, so Russia was integrated or partly integrated within the NATO Russia Council, the NATO Russia Founding Act 1997 was initiated, and other things were bargained, so there was some potential. Actually, when you trace back the discussions, there are two things. One thing is that Russia, or the Russian political elite, always claims that NATO assured Russia after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany not to enlarge to Eastern Europe. And they had guaranteed this and promised this to Gorbachev, and this promise had been broken. So that there's an interesting research project at the moment where historians go into the archives and try to figure out what happened at that time, because the Russians claim this, the Western politicians say no, we never promised that only related to Eastern Germany and other things. Actually, you need to go into the archives, who said what and what happened at that time. So, and this is also the point of reference. I think the problem is there is a problem with NATO. NATO is an anger point, definitely, but there had always been the potential or the possibility to bargain and to come to terms with each other. And the situation has worsened in the 2000s, and I think this has not, because Ukraine in its different pendling towards west and east, and Ukraine has always pursued like a pendling policy with regard to foreign relations, and a little bit to the west, a little bit with Russia, because you can't escape Russia somehow, but the west is also important, and it has always there was always the idea of becoming more integrated into NATO, but that had never been a real problem for Russia for a long time. In the 2000s, there were a lot of these negative experiences of exclusion, of sidelining, of turning reinterpreting the norms of the international relations one-sidedly, which was definitely true, I guess, so that the issue became socio-emotionally more important. Yeah, I think there's you have to understand the trajectory of the relationship and the development of the relationship to understand why this is so important now for the Russians. Of course, there is some economic rationale behind it, because of course Ukraine had been an important pillar of the Eurasian Economic Union. Now the Ukraine is lost, and the potential of the Eurasian Economic Union is also questionable. But the Eurasian Economic Union was its potential was questionable also with Ukraine. So because it was constructed in a way that it served the interests of Russia and not really the interests of the other participating states. So there was like also a one-sided construction, and the integration effect, the longer-term integration effect of the Eurasian Economic Union had been questionable from the beginning on due to its construction faults. What was the question? Yeah, this is. I think this is important to understand why it became so important now. And another thing one has to think about is that the ethnic situation in Ukraine had been holding. There were peaceful, more or less peaceful relations in Ukraine between ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians, and you can't even divide them on ethnic lines. Some speak Russian and are Ukrainians, and some are mixed. There were no problems for 25 years compared to other post-Soviet space, like post-Soviet countries like Georgia, like Moldova, like Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. We didn't see ethnopolitical conflict breaking out after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So the question is why only 25 years after, and why did Russia push and provoke this conflict only 25 years after? It could have also kept it quiet. Yeah, and that has a lot to do with the trajectory of the this is my position of the relations, and to assume that everything is geopolitics from the beginning on, or security inspired from the beginning on, is a little bit under complex, I would say. It's easy, yeah. Of course, you can define everything as a neorealist structure, because as we discussed earlier these days, neorealism or realism is a under complex theory, and everything fits under it. But you have to be more fine-tuned and understand what actually is happening underneath this surface. Yeah, I think that's important. And also that we see a transformation. Yeah, maybe in the Kosovo case in 1999, they cried out dictatorship, where Western dictate and humiliation and whatsoever. But it was not so grave. I mean, the consequences were not so grave. Okay, Yeltsin we shook hands with Yeltsin, and he was elevated to the G8, and things were okay. But now it's getting worse, and things are more serious, and so there's a transformation to it, and we have to understand this transformation. Yeah.
Maybe just in line with what Pedro was asking, would you see this transformation and this geopolitical, eventually also emotional side from the EU in its relations with Russia? Do you see that interplay?
I guess the EU is not a unified actor. Of course, yeah. That's nothing new. Of course, there's a push from the Eastern European countries to define it that way. Yeah, I mean, it lies in their interest, in their experience, in their historic memory, or whatever, to define it like this. These days, the German president Steinmeier visited Moscow under the pretext of understanding what Russia wants, and of saying that actually we have to continue or re-embark on a dialogue with Russia, because the relations have worsened so badly due to all these developments, that there is this is a low point which is no good for neither side. And so he went to Russia. Okay, he was not the visit was not very successful in that terms, but not the least, I mean, a try is a try. So here, that would probably underline what you said, that there is a geopoliticalization of the perceptions, and yeah, that's a dangerous path. And it's probably good to look in different ways to uncover what elements we have there as well. So to see that it's actually not, in fact, not everything about geopolitics. There are different things going on, and we have to address this. This is not to say that we should say, okay, let's accept that Crimea is now Russian territory, yeah, forever. So and we, of course, one can stand to, or one can say we do not accept it. We do not accept the breach of international norms or international law, and but we can understand it. We do not accept it. What we understand what happened, and we try to address the problematic issues that led to that, and probably then somewhere in the future we can deal with it in a better way. Yeah. So accepting something and understanding something are two different things.
I wanted to ask, as I was reading newspaper, the relation between Russia and Turkey is coming closer. How does this influences the European Union policy in the East Europe? And if?
In Eastern Europe, I have to think, but the first thing that came to my mind is, of course, the relation within NATO, or the atmosphere within NATO, because Turkey is still a NATO member, and it has some troublesome relations with Germany, with the US, with other Western countries. I think the relationship, or the good relationship between Turkey and Russia is it's a strategic decision, because I mean we saw how quickly the relation, the language can change from deadly foes, yeah, after the Russian pilot was shot down, towards like close friendship. That's not normal, kind of. So it's strategically inspired, and it's probably also an attempt, or you could read it as a Russian attempt to again spoil the relations within the EU, because Turkey is a strategically important partner when it comes to migration and the refugee issue, and it's very prickly. So it might be another attempt to trouble the EU, or maybe, we don't know, but it's strategic. It has some economic benefits, of course, to be in close relations. Russia being in close relations with Turkey has some economic benefits, but it doesn't really change the situation with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I guess. Russia is still very, very dominant there in the conflict regulation. Turkey is also like kind of engaging, but I think still Russia is dominating the process. So this is what comes to my mind on that question.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your lecture. It was different and interesting. And I have one question, and this is more related to the Ukraine. With the revolution in 2040 and today, Ukraine tried to construct a new identity, and the government has different policies like the communization of country. And in your opinion, you can see some ways to apply this your approach, emotional and moral, to today Ukraine situation, today Ukraine policy, and more European vector, geopolitical.
I have to think again. I mean, what's problematic is that when it comes to emotions or this emotional dimension, of course, the relations between Ukraine and Russia are spoiled for a long time. You see all these laws popping up in Ukraine that Russian movies are prohibited, and this is prohibited, and you are not allowed to commemorate the Second World War or something, yeah, things like that. So everything that has to do with Russia and its hegemonic past is forbidden, and they don't want to have to do anything with it. So that's of course a problematic path. Because I mean these memory wars. I mean there's memory wars going on in the post-Soviet space and in Ukraine now particularly, like the fight over definition hegemony. Yeah, who won or was Russia a good force or a bad force?
Discuss the history.
Yeah, discuss the history, exactly, and interpreting history is, I think, it might be helpful, but it is also, there's some conflictive potential in it, yeah, because you're dragging apart. Although I guess in the society, when Ukrainians have that experience, or the students that come to me, work with me, or study in Hamburg, they say we never had problems, and now there are rifts in between families. Because one is Ukrainian, one is Russian, and they don't know what to do, and so they are torn apart by this political dynamics. So I think this is not very healthy for the Ukrainian society, and I think the Ukrainian government should not overdo it in these terms. Yeah, I mean there is a past, and there is and Russia is a neighbor, a difficult neighbor, but of course you have to kind of come to terms with Russia as well in the future. I mean, and with the population, the Russian ethnic population, or those people who more cling to the Soviet past or whatever, or identify themselves more with the Soviet past. You have to deal with these people, yeah, and you make it worse maybe if you forbid everything that is connected with the Soviet past or with Russia. So this is, but there's also the memory wars has also a very emotional dimension. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I was thinking about China's growing role in Central Asia, and I was wondering if this might lead Russia to want to reinforce or reaffirm its power, its influence, its dominance over the post-Soviet countries in an attempt to be a counterweight to China's growing influence. So if that might lead Russia to have a more sort of aggressive or dominant stance in those countries in the near future?
I don't think so. I don't think that. I think Russia doesn't have the potential to do. I think China is much more powerful, and it's also much more powerful in the bilateral relations with Russia. Directly after the Ukrainian crisis and the Western sanctions, Russia started to make a pivot to China in bargaining an energy deal and a pipeline deal, and bargained this deal on very bad conditions because it was simply pressed and enforced to accept these conditions with China. So China has a much bigger potential, and Russia needs China in the post-Soviet space, security-wise, counterterrorism, and security activities within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other relations. So Russia is like the junior partner in that relationship. I don't think that it has the weight or the potential, the economic potential, maybe the military potential, but that wouldn't make much sense because the Central Asian states are more independent. They have a more independent stance than the post-Soviet countries that are in between the EU and Russia. The logics are a little bit different there, and Russia is a big force there, but I don't think that would be a scenario. And China is definitely on the rise there.
Okay. Was there a question here?
Thank you very much, Regina, for a very interesting talk and I think very convincing argument. I was just wondering, you mentioned it at the very end, the domestic factor, and I was wondering, you make the equation about the rationality of the Russian decision. If you bring in the domestic factor, would that change anything? In the sense that what happened in Ukraine, at least in the Russian perception, was something that was so unacceptable that maybe it was rational to intervene and to annex Crimea, if only to boost the popularity for Putin. I was just wondering to what extent that made a change. And second question would be, and it's one that is purely out of curiosity, is there any research that also looks into the emotional reactions of the West? Because you could say there was also anger, indignation about the annexation of Crimea, and it might be interesting in terms of the link to Russia, in the sense that you could say that Ukraine has become a sort of liability for the West as well today, because things are not going really well. It is definitely not much of a benefit for the West. So this could also be, this could mean there were no winners in this, that actually both lost on both sides, and the EU or the West and Russia.
The second question to my mind, specifically related to these dynamics with Ukraine and Russia, I can't think of any research on the Western reactions. There has been some research on the Iraq intervention, and some Western countries like France and Germany that did not join the coalition, the US coalition in Iraq, also under the pretext of emotions and respect and solidarity and things like that. So that is the argument that Schröder didn't join because he felt disrespected by the Americans in some dynamic. I can't recall exactly what happened there, but so there are. So the point is probably that you want to highlight, and I think it's correct to say, this is not only a Russian problem. Yeah, the emotions are not only a Russian problem, because they say, oh, the Russians are so emotional, and oh, it's in their heart, yeah. But that is not my point. It's probably it's a most applicable case due to the apparent status loss. So this is the basic assumption from which I can apply the social status assumption, or use it and make sense of it. But that would apply to China and the age of humiliation, and how China now tries to resurrect. And that would apply also maybe to other countries in other situations. So this is not nothing special. Russia is not a pathologic country, unlearnable or anything. But it's just like very intrusive to apply it, and for me more intrusive because I'm researching on Russia, and I know a little bit. I claim I know a little bit of the countries. I thought that would fit. And the first, the domestic factor, I think that even if power consolidation would have played a role, and say, so okay, so we are done. Yeah, after 2011 and 12, our population dislikes us, and our power basis is breaking apart. So we need to embark on something, and best is to identify external enemies cover the domestic problems. Yeah. And give some new solidarity and identity within the population, and solidarity for the government. So that would be the domestic power calculation explanation. But even if that would apply, then you need you need to understand that embarking on the emotions or recalling emotions and anger feelings, that they must resonate in order to work. So they must resonate in the population, they must be accepted as valid, and if they are accepted as valid, they have some emotional foundation in the collective memory. So still, if it was all about domestic power consolidation, still emotions would have been instrumentalized, but still they have to have some resonance in the collective identity, and that would be then the link to the social emotion, to the relational dynamic, and the international relations dynamic, and the social emotional aspect of the relationship. Yeah, so it is kind of intertwined. It's difficult to extract or distill these single things, but I think you can. I would also say it's not exclusively this, exclusively that, and there's a transformation to geopolitics, and suddenly then everything is geopolitics, and then it is geopolitics, and people think geopolitically, but there's how it comes to that, and what element plays a role at what moment is probably important to understand what happened, or to unwind probably this spiral again.
Any final question? No? So just help me in thanking again Regina for this excellent lecture. Thanks so much again for coming. Thank you.